I want to start by saying something that might seem obvious to anyone who actually reads the academic literature, but which remains absolutely forbidden in polite American discourse. Sanctions don't work. They never have, they never will. And the fact that we keep implementing them, that we keep pretending they're a serious policy tool, tells us something profound about the state of American leadership and the desperation underlying American foreign policy. Let me explain what I mean, because I think once you understand this, you'll start to see the whole architecture of contemporary American imperialism differently. The historical record, a century of failure. Look at the data. The United States has been sanctioning Cuba for 70 years, 7 decades. And what has that achieved? Did the Cuban government collapse? Did Fidel Castro get overthrown? Did the Cuban people rise up and restore capitalism? No, none of those things happened. Cuba is still there. The Cuban Revolution survived. The sanctions failed completely to achieve their stated objective. Now, you might say, well, that's one case. Maybe we've learned something in the last 70 years. But here's the thing. We haven't. We've learned absolutely nothing. We keep repeating the same policy over and over again, expecting different results. That's not policy, that's insanity. Look at Iran. The United States has been sanctioning Iran for decades. Has it changed Iranian policy? Has it made Iran more compliant with American wishes? Or has it in fact driven Iran closer to Russia and China, strengthened the hardliners within Iranian politics, and made Iran more determined to develop nuclear capacity as a deterrent against American aggression? The answer is obvious. Sanctions against Iran have been a catastrophic failure from the perspective of American strategic interests. But they've been remarkably successful at one thing. They've strengthened Iran's hand by forcing it to develop independent economic relationships and to position itself as a nation resisting American imperialism. And now we're doing it again. We're threatening to impose massive tariffs on China. We're threatening sanctions on India. We're implementing tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And the people implementing these policies know, they absolutely know that this won't work. They know the historical record. They know the economic theory. They know what actually happens when you try to coerce economically sophisticated nations. So why do they do it? That's the question we need to answer, because the answer tells us everything about the real state of American power. The mask slips. Understanding political theater. Here's what I think is actually happening, and I want you to sit with this because it's important. American elites, including the current administration, are engaged in an elaborate performance for domestic consumption. It's theater. It's kabuki. It's a show put on for the American people because the truth, the actual truth about American economic power, is too painful to admit publicly. The truth is this: the United States is no longer economically dominant in the way it was. The manufacturing base has been devastated. Productive capacity has been offshored. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is under genuine threat. American political institutions have become obviously dysfunctional. And most importantly, there are now competing power centers in the world: China, Russia, India, the European Union, that can actually resist American coercion. But you can't tell the American people that.
You can't wake up on the Monday morning and announce, hey, folks, our empire is in decline, our policies don't work anymore, and we're going to have to fundamentally reorganize how we relate to the rest of the world. That would cause panic, that would cause a political crisis, that would force difficult conversations about inequality, about militarism, about the structure of American capitalism itself. So instead, you perform power. You announce tariffs with swagger. You declare sanctions with confidence. You send your Secretary of State out to make bold proclamations about American strength and American resolve. And you hope that if you say it loud enough, if you perform it convincingly enough, people will believe it, both domestically and internationally. But here's the joke. Nobody believes it. Not really. Not anymore. The practical limits of coercion in a multipolar world.
Now, I want to get into the specifics of how sanctions and tariffs actually fail in practice, because this is where the economic analysis becomes really important. When you attempt to sanction or tariff a sophisticated nation like China or Russia, what actually happens? Well, first of all, they have resources. They have capital. They have alternatives. If you block their access to American markets, they sell to other markets. If you freeze their assets, they move their capital elsewhere. If you restrict their access to certain technologies, they work with other nations to develop alternatives or to acquire them through third parties. The ways to circumvent sanctions are actually quite well documented. You use transshipment ports. You ship goods to a neutral country first, then reroute them to the sanctioned nation under a different label.
You use shell companies and complex financial structures to obscure the origin and destination of capital flows. You engage in barter arrangements or bilateral trade that bypasses dollar-denominated transactions. You develop alternative payment systems, and this is key, systems that don't depend on the American banking infrastructure. China and Russia are not stupid about this. They've been studying sanctions for decades. They know all the tricks. They've prepared for this. They have contingency plans on top of contingency plans. But here's what's really interesting. The nations that are most vulnerable to sanctions are usually not the ones we're trying to sanction. It's the smaller nations that try to comply with American demands who actually suffer. It's the nations that try to be good partners with the United States that get economically devastated when they align with America and then America changes direction or changes its demands. So what do smaller nations learn from this? They learn that being America's ally is economically risky. They learn that they need to diversify their relationships. They learn that they need to build relationships with China, with Russia, with India, with other regional powers, precisely to protect themselves against the unpredictability of American foreign policy. In other words, American sanctions are actually driving the very thing that American strategic planners claim to oppose: the development of alternative economic blocs, the movement away from American economic dominance, the formation of coalitions explicitly designed to resist American coercion. We are, quite literally, coercing the world into abandoning us. The hidden architecture, how America actually survives on borrowed time.
Now, let me talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in mainstream American discourse, something that reveals the fundamental fragility underlying American economic power. I'm talking about the relationship between the United States government and its creditors, particularly China, through the mechanism of government debt. Here's a fact that should alarm every American. China owns approximately $800 billion in United States Treasury securities. Let me translate that into what it actually means. When the American government issues Treasury bonds, it's borrowing money. It promises to pay back that money plus interest. The interest rate on those bonds fluctuates, but let's say it's around 5% right now. So if China owns $800 billion in Treasury bonds at 5% interest, that means the American government has to pay China $40 billion per year, every year.
Now, where does that $40 billion come from?
It comes from American taxpayers. It comes from the American government budget. It comes from the same pool of money that could theoretically be spent on fixing roads, on education, on health care, on housing assistance, on any of the things that might actually improve the material conditions of American working people. Instead, $40 billion a year flows directly from the American Treasury to the Chinese government. American workers are, in effect, subsidizing the Chinese state. And this is barely discussed. This is almost invisible in American political discourse. Why? Because it exposes something that the American power structure would rather keep hidden. It exposes the fact that American economic dominance is not based on productive superiority anymore. It's based on debt. It's based on the willingness of other nations to hold American assets. It's based on a financial arrangement that is inherently unstable and that could collapse if the people holding American debt decide that holding it is no longer in their interest. Now, you might think, well, why would China do that? Why would China dump its treasury holdings? Wouldn't that hurt China too? And the answer is yes, it would hurt China in the short term. The price of American bonds would fall, interest rates would spike, the global financial system would experience serious disruption. China would lose money on its existing holdings. But here's the thing. China has been reducing its treasury holdings. They've dropped from over $1 trillion just a few years ago to around $800 billion now. This is not accidental. This is a deliberate strategic choice by the Chinese government to reduce its dependence on the American financial system. Why are they doing this? Well, I think there are several reasons. First, the Chinese recognize that American debt levels are unsustainable. The United States is the world's largest debtor nation. Our national debt has grown to levels that just 30 years ago would have been considered absolutely catastrophic. We're running trillion-dollar annual deficits as a matter of routine. The trajectory is clearly unsustainable. Second, the Chinese understand that political dysfunction in America means unpredictability. If American policymakers are unstable, if they're willing to sanction you or tariff you on a whim, then holding American debt becomes risky. You could wake up tomorrow and discover that the American government has frozen your assets, or declared your treasury holdings invalid, or done something else equally dramatic. Third, and this is the most important, the Chinese are positioning themselves for a world in which the dollar is no longer the sole global reserve currency. They're building alternatives. They're developing payment systems that don't depend on the American banking infrastructure. They're strengthening their relationships with other nations. They're preparing for a future in which American financial dominance no longer exists. And the fascinating thing, the thing that would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic, is that this is exactly what American policy is pushing them to do. The decline of American manufacturing and the illusion of service economy dominance. You know, there's this old idea in American capitalism that we don't need to make things anymore, that we can be a service economy, that we can be the global financial center and everything will be fine. This idea is absolutely nonsensical, and it's the product of a specific historical moment and a very flawed understanding of economic power. Here's what happened. After the Second World War, the United States had enormous productive capacity. We were the only developed industrial power that hadn't been devastated by the war. We could manufacture things cheaper than anyone else. We could export manufactured goods all over the world. This gave us economic and political power. But starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, American corporations decided that they could increase profits by moving manufacturing overseas. They could pay workers in China or Mexico or Vietnam a fraction of what they paid American workers, maintain similar productivity through technology and management techniques, and pocket the difference as profit. This was good for corporate profits. It was good for wealthy shareholders. It was disastrous for American workers and American communities. But nobody in power cared about that. The profit motive took precedence over everything else. The result was the decimation of American manufacturing. Cities that had been built on factories, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Gary, Youngstown, became hollowed out. Working class communities were devastated. Real wages for American workers stagnated. Millions of people who had expected to work in stable, well-paying manufacturing jobs found themselves competing for low-wage service work or unemployment. Meanwhile, the people who own capital, the shareholders, the executives, the financial elite, did extraordinarily well. Their wealth accumulated. Their political power grew. They became even more dominant within American politics. So what do we have now? We have a nation that doesn't make much of anything anymore. We've outsourced most manufacturing. We've become dependent on imports for basic goods. And we've tried to compensate by claiming that we're now a financial services economy, as if shuffling money around between different financial instruments is equivalent to actually producing something of value. But here's the problem. You can't build a sustainable empire on financial services alone. At some point, the financial system has to be backed by something real. It has to be backed by productive capacity, by resources, by the ability to actually make things that people want to buy. America has less and less of that. We've hollowed ourselves out. The debt trap: how American politics outsourced difficult choices. I want to talk now about how this debt situation came about, because it reveals something really important about the nature of American political capitalism and the contradictions it's built on. After World War II, when the United States was genuinely dominant, when we really did have the most productive economy in the world, the question became how to maintain that dominance. One option was to invest heavily in domestic production, in infrastructure, in education, in the well-being of the American working class.
Another option was to build a global military empire to enforce American interests worldwide. American elites chose both. They decided that the United States would be the global military hegemon. We would have military bases all over the world. We would maintain the largest military budget on the planet. We would be prepared to intervene militarily anywhere that American interests were threatened. This is expensive, enormously expensive. But there was a problem. How do you convince American workers and taxpayers to pay for a global military empire? You can't exactly be honest about it. You can't say, we need to tax you heavily so we can maintain military bases in 130 countries. That would be unpopular. So what do you do instead? You engage in what I can only call a grand compromise between the two major political parties. The Democrats say, we want to maintain social spending. We want to fund health care, education, Social Security, housing assistance, all the things that help working people. That costs money. They want to raise taxes to pay for it. The Republicans say, we don't want to raise taxes on the wealthy or on corporations. That's our priority. We'll cut taxes, especially for the rich. That loses money from the government budget. So how do you resolve this contradiction? How do you maintain military spending, maintain social spending, cut taxes on the wealthy, and keep the government functioning? The answer is beautifully simple and catastrophically destructive. You borrow money. You run deficits. You accumulate debt. For the last 40 years, this is exactly what American governments have done. Democratic administrations have run deficits. Republican administrations have run deficits. The deficits have gotten progressively larger. The national debt has grown to astronomical levels. And for most of that time, it worked. It worked because the rest of the world was willing to lend to the United States. Japan wanted to buy treasury bonds. Saudi Arabia wanted to buy treasury bonds. China wanted to buy treasury bonds. Everyone wanted to buy them because treasury bonds were considered safe, because they were denominated in dollars, and because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. But here's the thing about borrowing indefinitely. At some point, creditors start asking questions. At some point, they start wondering whether they're ever actually going to get paid back. At some point, they start looking for alternatives. We're approaching that point now. The psychological crisis. What happens when an empire admits decline? I want to talk about something psychological here. Something that I think is really important to understanding why American policymakers keep making these terrible decisions, why they keep implementing policies they know won't work. It's painful to be part of a declining power. It's psychologically difficult. You've grown up believing that your nation is exceptional, that it's the greatest power in the world, that it's destined to lead. And then you watch as that power erodes. You watch as other nations rise. You watch as American influence diminishes. You watch as the rest of the world stops accepting American leadership as legitimate. This is genuinely traumatic for people who have built their entire identities around American dominance. So what do? They deny it. They engage in what I can only describe as magical thinking. They convince themselves that if they just perform power convincingly enough, if they just assert American dominance forcefully enough, if they just impose enough sanctions and tariffs and military threats, somehow the underlying reality will change.
Somehow America will regain its former dominance. This is not rational.
This is not based on any serious analysis of economic or geopolitical trends. This is based on psychological denial, and it manifests in this bizarre behavior where American policymakers make increasingly desperate and increasingly ineffective policy moves. They're not based on reality. They're based on the need to feel powerful, the need to perform dominance, the need to convince themselves and others that America is still in charge. But it's transparent, absolutely transparent. The rest of the world can see it. China can see it. Russia can see it. India can see it. They understand that America is lashing out because it's losing power, not because it's confident in its power. And when the rest of the world understands that your power is based on desperation rather than genuine capability, that's when your power really starts to evaporate. The Ukraine catastrophe, a masterclass in imperial miscalculation.
Let me give you a specific example of this kind of thinking because I think it illuminates the broader problem. I'm talking about the Ukraine situation, and more specifically, the decision to expand NATO eastward in the decade leading up to the Russian invasion. The historical record on this is becoming increasingly clear, and it's damning. The decision to push NATO membership toward Ukraine was based on a profound misreading of Russian interests, and more importantly, a profound overestimation of American ability to impose its will on the world. The thinking went like this: if we expand NATO far enough east, if we get Ukraine into NATO, if we station NATO military infrastructure close to the Russian border, Russia will either accept it or collapse. That was the assumption. That was the bet that was made.
But this assumption was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian power, Russian history, and Russian strategic thinking. It was based on the idea that Russia was permanently weakened after the Cold War, that Russia would never be able to develop the economic or military capacity to resist American pressure, that Russia would remain subordinate to the West indefinitely. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. When faced with the reality of NATO expansion and American military pressure, Russia didn't collapse. Russia didn't capitulate. Russia responded by strengthening its relationships with China and India and other nations in the global South. Russia integrated itself into alternative economic structures. Russia built the BRICS coalition into a genuine counterweight to Western dominance. And when Western nations imposed sanctions on Russia to punish the invasion of Ukraine, Russia simply sold its oil and gas to China and India. The sanctions didn't isolate Russia. The working people in New York City voted for someone who represents a fundamental challenge to that traditional coalition because they're exhausted with status quo politics. These are not isolated phenomena. These are signals of a global fracturing, a breaking apart of the consensus that the United States has maintained since the end of the Cold War. The class character of imperial decline. Who pays the price? Now I want to talk about something that rarely gets discussed openly in American politics. Something that I think is absolutely fundamental to understanding what's happening. The class dimension of American decline. When an empire declines, the costs of that decline don't get distributed equally.
The wealthy use their political power to protect their wealth. The working class absorbs the pain. Think about it this way. The United States economy is declining relative to the rest of the world. American productive capacity has been devastated. American real wages have stagnated. American infrastructure is crumbling. The purchasing power of American workers has declined. These are objective facts. But look at the stock market. The stock market is at historic highs. Corporate profits are near historic highs. The wealth of the top 10% of Americans continues to grow. Billionaires have gotten dramatically richer in the last decade. The CEO of a major corporation today makes 300 times what the average worker makes, compared to about 20 times in the 1950s. How is this possible? How can the American economy be in relative decline while American elites are getting richer? The answer is that the decline is being concentrated on working people. The costs of empire are being borne by workers, while the benefits are being captured by capital. Here's what this looks like concretely. Prices at Walmart are soaring. Prices at Target are soaring. Grocery prices are soaring. Rent prices are astronomical. Healthcare costs are crushing people. Student debt has become a permanent feature of American life for young people. Meanwhile, the people who own assets, stock portfolios, real estate, corporate profits, are doing fine. Their wealth is increasing. This is creating a political time bomb in America. You see, what made American capitalism distinctive in the history of capitalism was that there was a large middle class. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just the natural working out of market forces. This was the result of specific historical factors: the strength of labor unions after World War II, the power of working-class political movements, the willingness of capital to allow some redistribution in exchange for political stability. For most of the 20th century, real wages in America grew. Workers could buy homes. They could put their kids through college. They could retire with pensions. There was genuine upward mobility. This created the mythology of American exceptionalism, the idea that America was different, that America was more egalitarian, that America offered genuine opportunity. But over the last 40 years, this has been systematically dismantled. Union membership has collapsed. Real wages have stagnated. Healthcare and education have become increasingly expensive and increasingly tied to employment or wealth. The middle class is shrinking. Young people have no expectation of doing better than their parents. This is not sustainable politically. You cannot have an empire where the vast majority of people are experiencing declining material conditions while the tiny elite at the top continues to accumulate wealth. At some point, people become angry. At some point, they reject the political status quo. At some point, they look for radical alternatives. We're at that point now. The Trump phenomenon. Rage against the machine. This is what Trump represents. I want to be very clear. Trump himself is not particularly important. Trump is a symptom, not the disease. Trump is the manifestation of genuine popular rage against the status quo. A significant portion of the American working and lower middle class is so angry at existing political arrangements, so disgusted with the way both parties have served corporate interests while ignoring working people, that they were willing to vote for someone who at least promised to disrupt things, to challenge the establishment, to do something different. The Democratic Party, for its part, has lost the working class. This is historically significant. The Democratic Party inherited a strong working class base from the New Deal and from Franklin Roosevelt. Working class people voted for Democrats because the Democrats had actually improved their material conditions. But over the last 40 years, the Democratic Party has failed to extend or maintain those gains.
It has become the party of professional class liberals, of Wall Street, of corporate interests. So the working class, which has been getting progressively poorer, which has been losing jobs and communities and dignity, looked around and said, "The Democrats aren't offering anything for us. Why should we support them?" And they voted for Trump. Now, Trump didn't actually offer them anything either. Trump is a billionaire real estate developer who has never worked a day in his life. Trump's economic policies are designed to benefit the wealthy and corporations. But at least Trump was willing to talk like he was an outsider, to challenge some aspects of the status quo, to perform opposition to the establishment. This is what happens when existing political parties fail to serve working class interests. People look for alternatives, no matter how inadequate those alternatives might be. And here's the thing, this is not unique to America. This is happening all over the world. In every country where working people have experienced decades of declining living standards, where neoliberal policies have gutted social spending, where austerity has been imposed in the name of fiscal responsibility, we see the rise of anti-establishment political movements. We see people voting for politicians who promise radical change. We see the breakdown of post-war political consensus. This is what happens at the end of an epoch. The old arrangements break down. The old parties lose their legitimacy. People search for alternatives. The global implications. BRICS and the challenge to American hegemony. I want to talk now about what's happening at the global level, because I think this is where the real story of American decline becomes most visible. For 70 years, since the end of World War II, the international order has been structured around American dominance. The United States has the largest military. The United States has the largest economy. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. International institutions, like the IMF and World Bank, are controlled by the United States. American military bases surround the world. American naval power controls the world's sea lanes. This order has been challenged before, by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but the challenger has been defeated and the order has survived. Now, however, the challenge is different. It's not coming from a rival superpower that's going to engage in a military arms race with the United States. The challenge is coming from the simple fact that the rest of the world has developed productive capacity, that other nations have accumulated capital, that other powers are rising economically while the United States is declining. The BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represents something genuinely new in global politics. These are not vassal states. These are not peripheral economies. These are serious powers with nuclear weapons, with sophisticated economies, with alternative models of development, with the capacity to resist American demands. And unlike the Soviet Union, the BRICS nations are not trying to create a competing global system that encompasses everything. They're simply trying to create space for their own development,
their own political autonomy, their own economic sovereignty. They want to trade with each other without going through the United States. They want to develop alternative financial systems. They want to have political voice in international institutions. They're not necessarily hostile to the West, but they're not subordinate to it either. This is deeply threatening to American elites because it means the era of American dominance is actually ending. It means other nations are becoming powerful enough that they can say no to American demands without suffering catastrophic consequences. And how are American elites responding? By imposing tariffs and sanctions that don't work, that accelerate the very decline they're trying to prevent. By lashing out militarily in ways that are counterproductive. By engaging in political theater designed to convince people that American power is still real when the underlying facts suggest otherwise. The irony of rogue state status. Here's something genuinely ironic that I want you to think about. After the recent rounds of tariffs and sanctions, the United States is increasingly viewed around the world, even by traditional allies, as an unstable, unpredictable actor. In other words, America is acquiring the international status of a rogue state. Now think about what this means. When you're viewed as a rogue state, as an unreliable actor, what happens? Every other nation has an incentive to develop alternatives to dependence on you. Every business executive calculating where to invest looks at you as a risky bet. Every government official thinks about how to protect their nation from your unpredictable actions. This is exactly the opposite of what American dominance required. American dominance was based on the rest of the world wanting to participate in the American system, wanting to buy American goods, wanting to hold American assets, wanting to maintain the dollar as their reserve currency. But if America is an unstable, unpredictable rogue state, why would you want to depend on it? And here's what's beautiful about this from a historical perspective. Every political leader in every country now has a perfect excuse. When their economy suffers, when there's a recession, when there's social unrest, they can blame America. They can blame American tariffs, American sanctions, American economic warfare. This gives them an outlet for social anger, a way to unite their populations against an external enemy. This is what hegemons lose when they resort to coercion, legitimacy. They stop being seen as leaders and start being seen as oppressors. The infrastructure of dependency, how empires maintain power. I want to talk for a moment about how empires actually maintain power, because I think this illuminates what's happening right now. Imperial power is not primarily based on military force, despite what people often think. Military force is important, and empires certainly use it, but it's not the foundation of imperial power. The foundation of imperial power is structural dependence. It's the fact that other nations are so integrated into your economic system that they cannot afford to break away from it. After World War II, the United States maintained global hegemony not primarily through military bases, though those were important, but through the dollar system. Every nation that wanted to participate in global trade had to use dollars. Every nation that wanted to maintain foreign exchange reserves held dollars.
Every nation that wanted to borrow money borrowed in dollars. This created a structural situation where no nation could escape American power. Even if they wanted to challenge the United States politically, they were trapped within an economic system controlled by the United States. The United States could print dollars to pay for military spending. The United States could run trade deficits indefinitely because the rest of the world had to use dollars. This was genuine structural power. This was not something that depended on the cooperation or consent of other nations. It was simply built into the system itself. But systems like this are inherently fragile. They depend on the rest of the world accepting the fundamental terms of the arrangement. As soon as there's an alternative, as soon as there's another power that's developed enough that it can create its own payment systems and alternative trade networks, the whole arrangement becomes vulnerable. And that's where we are now. China has developed enough productive capacity, enough capital, enough technological sophistication that it can actually create alternatives. They're building the Belt and Road Initiative. They're creating alternative payment systems using the Chinese yuan. They're developing digital currencies that don't depend on the dollar. They're building trade relationships that don't go through American-controlled channels. This doesn't necessarily mean that China will replace the United States as the dominant global power in the near term. It might not. But it definitely means that American unipolarity is over. The question is no longer whether American dominance will persist, but rather how quickly it will erode and what happens during that erosion process. The fundamental contradiction: debt and dominance. Let me talk about something that I think is absolutely central to understanding where the American system is heading. It's the fundamental contradiction between being a debtor nation and trying to maintain global dominance. The United States is deeply in debt. I'm not talking about the debt that individual Americans owe to banks. I'm talking about the national debt, the debt that the American government owes to its creditors, both domestic and foreign. The national debt is now over $33 trillion. The deficit, the annual increase in debt, is over $1.5 trillion per year, and the trajectory is clearly unsustainable. The recent budget deal passed by Congress doesn't address this problem. It makes it worse. It locks in trillion-dollar annual deficits indefinitely. Now, for a long time, this didn't matter very much because the rest of the world was willing to lend to the United States. The United States could borrow basically unlimited amounts of money because the dollar was the reserve currency and American assets were considered safe. But here's the thing about lending relationships: they depend on creditors trusting that debtors will eventually pay them back. When debt levels start to look genuinely unsustainable, when the trajectory of debt starts to look truly alarming, creditors start to get nervous. They start to ask questions. They start to wonder whether lending more money is a good idea. And here's the problem from the perspective of American dominance. If creditors start to reduce their lending to the United States, American policymakers face a choice. They can either cut spending, which is politically impossible because that would mean cutting either the military or Social Security and Medicare, or they can allow interest rates to rise to attract more creditors. But higher interest rates would slow economic growth, would make existing debt more expensive to service, would likely precipitate a recession. In other words,
The United States is in a debt trap.
We cannot sustain current levels of spending. We cannot cut spending without political catastrophe. We cannot raise taxes because wealthy people control politics and they refuse to be taxed. So we continue to borrow. Our debt continues to grow, and at some point, nobody knows exactly when, the music stops. This is not a prediction. This is not speculation. This is what the arithmetic tells us. At some point, this becomes unsustainable. The internal contradiction, inequality, and legitimacy. But I think there's actually something more fundamental than the debt problem. I think the real crisis of American capitalism is the crisis of legitimacy created by inequality. Look at the numbers. The top 1% now owns roughly 32% of all wealth in America. The top 10% owns roughly 67% of all wealth. The bottom 50% owns roughly 3% of all wealth. This is the most unequal distribution of wealth in American history since the 1920s. This is not just a moral problem. This is an economic problem. This is a political problem. This is a problem that undermines the legitimacy of the entire system. You see, capitalism can sustain itself through coercion for a while. You can use police and military force to maintain property relations. But in the long term, capitalism requires legitimacy. It requires people to believe that the system is fundamentally fair, that hard work will be rewarded, that anyone can get ahead if they work hard enough. This is what American capitalism sold itself on for much of the 20th century, the American dream, the belief that if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could get ahead, you could buy a house, you could send your kids to college, you could retire comfortably. This was the deal. But that deal has broken down. Young people today have no expectation of doing better than their parents. A single medical emergency can bankrupt the family. Buying a home is impossible for most young people. Getting through college without crushing debt is nearly impossible. So you have a situation where the system is telling people, work hard and you'll succeed, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible for them to succeed through any amount of work. This creates rage. This creates a sense of injustice. This creates a willingness to vote for radical alternatives. This is what's really destabilizing the American system. Not the military balance, not international relations. It's the internal contradiction between what capitalism promises and what it actually delivers. Looking forward, the transition. So where are we headed? Let me be direct about this because I think clarity is important. The American global empire is in terminal decline. This is not speculation. This is not ideology. This is observable in the data. America's share of global GDP has been declining for decades. American manufacturing capacity has been decimated. American infrastructure is crumbling. American real wages have stagnated. The rest of the world has caught up. But the process of imperial decline is messy and chaotic and unpredictable. Empires don't decline smoothly. Empires cling to power. They lash out. They make desperate decisions. Sometimes those desperate decisions prevent the worst outcomes. Sometimes they accelerate catastrophe.
I think what we're seeing with the tariffs and the sanctions and the military posturing is the desperation phase of American decline, the phase where the system is no longer capable of managing global affairs smoothly, but is still powerful enough to make big disruptions. This creates genuine instability. It creates the possibility of serious economic disruptions. It creates the possibility of military conflicts. It creates real uncertainty about what the world looks like 10 or 20 years from now. But it also creates opportunity. It creates the possibility that alternative systems could develop. It creates the possibility that nations could organize themselves differently. It creates the possibility that working people could demand and potentially win a different arrangement of global affairs. The old consensus is breaking down everywhere. In France, in Germany, in America, in the UK. The post-war political consensus that served the interests of capital while maintaining enough social spending to keep working people relatively stable has broken down. The question now is, what replaces it? Will it be something that benefits working people? Or will it be something that concentrates even more power and wealth among elites, while conditions for working people continue to deteriorate? That hasn't been determined yet. That's still to be written. That depends on what working people do, on what political movements emerge, on what kinds of struggles develop. But what we can say with certainty is that the old order is dying. The American-led global capitalist empire is in decline. The question is not whether it will decline. The question is how quickly it will decline and what emerges in its place. That's the real political issue of our time.